Hello, Dr. Merrill. How are you? I think you're.
Hello there, Dr. Smith.
How goes it?
It goes well. Here's a funny thing. I had a call today scheduled, and somebody I work with in Washington, and she called and she said, I'm in the Bahamas. And
Oh,
I said, you're not going to believe it, but I'm about to get
you're kind of there too. Nice. How'd the workshop go?
It was fun. You've got some really great students. I was telling Dustin how much I enjoyed working with them.
Good. Yeah, you were with them for what, almost 4 hours. One of them sent me a message like, "Yeah, we just got out." I'm like, "You just got out?" It's like, "Yeah," and he only left because he had to make a phone call. I was like, "Okay, I guess that's a good sign."
Yeah, it was good. No, I had my staff meeting, so I had to get to that. But
Right.
yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for doing that. It was really pretty exciting for the students, I think. And
yeah,
I enjoyed it. I completely enjoyed myself. Yeah.
Good. All right, we're just going to take maybe about 4 or 5 minutes for folks to get on, and then we'll get it together.
Okay.
All right. I feel like we should have some elevator music or something just playing in the background.
Yeah, that
I
would
can
be
just start
nice.
seamlessly humming. There might have been a little confusion because one of the documents I had with the total list said that this was supposed to be at 7.
Is that right?
That's why I got confused until I saw the flyer.
Yeah, the flyer says 6.
Yeah,
You may have one of the earlier,
maybe.
maybe one of the earlier drafts of the program.
Yeah, no big deal.
And if folks registered, they would have registered for 6 o'clock. It would have registered at 6. All right, just another 2 more minutes. All right. It's 5 minutes after the hour. Ah, okay. All right, so there has been some confusion about time, but we'll go for it. Hopefully the email reminders, people will get it together. So, all right, so for those who are here, oh, sorry. Thank you for being here. Apologies for any confusion regarding the start time, but this will be recorded like everything else and will be available for folks who are interested in hearing it. But hopefully folks will trickle in as the time passes. So first of all, good evening. My name is Craig Smith. I am a professor in the School of English, University of the Bahamas, and director of the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival. And so I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to welcome you to this keynote address. And this keynote address is the culmination of the 4th Annual Blue Flamingo Literary Festival, hosted by the University of the Bahamas. And so as you all know, last year in 2020, the main festival had to be canceled due to the national lockdown resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the fall of that semester, the committee decided to move forward using the available online platforms, and we hosted a series of discussions in the fall, and those were very successful, and that gave us the encouragement to plan this year's festival using the same platform, using Zoom. And so we went ahead and planned the festival, the 2 days, yesterday and today. And, you know, I'm overwhelmed by the turnout that we've received for both days of the festival. We had several very successful workshops. We had writing after retirement workshop. We had a poetry workshop for high school, as well as a fiction workshop for high school. We had another poetry and fiction workshop for university students. We've had an old story, new voices panel with UB students reading their original Bahamian folk tales. We've just come off of many wonderful panels this afternoon, a panel on discussing Bahamian literature over the last 30 years, another panel talking about Caribbean theater, where we've been, where we are, where we're going, and so many more. And as I said before, all of these are available. Everything was recorded. And so if folks are interested, they can definitely contact us and we will send them the link. So now in its fourth year, the aim of the festival is to promote reading, writing, and literary arts within the Bahamas by reaching out to local, regional, and international partners. The Blue Flamingo Literary Festival hopes to create a space for developing, highlighting, and encouraging a thriving Bahamian literary culture. The Blue Flamingo Literary Festival includes poetry readings, book launches, panel discussions, writings, workshops, live stage music and spoken word performances, writing and poetry contests, as well as activities specifically targeted towards Bahamian youth. Now, before we move forward, I would like to recognize the committee members of the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival for all their hard work in organizing these events. They are Dr. Marie Searsing, Dr. Dustin Helberg, Dr. Saskia First, Bridget Stewart, Ivy Higgins, Malin Seymour, and Princess Pratt. I would also like to thank the chair of School of English, Dr. Mayuri Dika, and the dean of the Faculty of Liberal and Fine Arts, Dr. Douglas Barkey, for their continued support of the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival. I would also want to thank our guest speakers throughout yesterday and today. Also, the audience, those of you who showed up, many of our students showed up. And, you know, usually students come in for like 10 minutes and then they dip out. But I was glad to see that students actually stayed the entire time for those who were assigned one of the panels and even came back to other panels. So I really want to thank them for being with us and being a part of the audience. I just want to do a few housekeeping. We would ask the audience to write all questions in the chat. Please do not unmute yourselves. These will be monitored by myself, and whatever questions you might have that come up during the talk, I can give them to either the moderator or directly to the speaker when the Q&A starts. And now to introduce our keynote speaker, I want to introduce Dr. Dustin Helberg. Dr. Helberg holds a PhD in English literature and philosophy of science. He also has a master's from the Iowa Writers Workshop in poetry. He is the author of 3 books in poetry, fiction, and criticism, as well as many academic articles on a host of subjects. He currently teaches creative writing at University of the Bahamas, and he's dividing his time between Nassau and Iowa. Dr. Helberg.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this final event at the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival COVID edition. I want to go through a few thanks of my own, in addition to Dr. Smith's, and thank our panel moderators. thank our workshop leaders, thank the students who attended those, the students who submitted their work for the contest. I see some of my students in the participant list here, so hi. To our benefactors, our staff and faculty at UB, and most of all, to all of you who joined us and are joining us for the festival this year. I have a few prefatory details to mention before I begin the introductions. The program, the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival, is brought to you in conjunction with the School of English Studies at the University of the Bahamas, where students can earn a Bachelor of Arts in English or specialize in creative writing, Bahamian and Caribbean literature, film and drama studies, or linguistics. English majors enjoy small class sizes, have the opportunity to participate in student publications and internships, and are prepared to take advantage of the many work opportunities for creative professionals that place a premium on advanced writing skills. Many of our alumni have also gone on to graduate school or become certified K through 12 teachers. In the chat, we will be putting a link to our Facebook page, as well as the opportunity for those of you with money burning holes in your pocket. If you want to donate any money to the Blue Flamingo Festival, we would more than welcome that opportunity. Sonia Farmer mentioned it yesterday in her discussion, but the Bahamas entered the COVID era already reeling from the devastation of Hurricane Dorian. At some point in the course of healing from something so thoroughly destructive, it becomes necessary to stop discussing it. But now is not that time, I think. I would like to take a moment for us to reflect and mourn together the lives lost to Dorian, to the senselessness of natural disasters in the face of climate change, as well as those lives lost to the pandemic. These people are most missed and will not be forgotten. Now to tonight's keynote speaker, someone I am very excited to have with us. Chris Merrill has directed the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa for the past 2 decades, working and collaborating with writers from around the world. He is the author of many award-winning books in poetry, translation, and nonfiction. He serves on the National Commission for UNESCO, and in 2012, President Obama appointed him to the National Council on the Humanities. He was also knighted, made a chevalier by the French government. I joked with him last night that the best rhyme I could find with chevalier was Sidney Poitier, which I thought was very fitting. It's not often you get to meet and chat with a real knight. I've known Chris for a long while now, having met him while I was a grad student at the Writers' Workshop. The last time I spoke with my friend and mentor, Marvin Bell, a great poet who died earlier this year, Marvin said of Chris, quote, "Working with Chris is like having the best deadline always hanging over you. He pushes you in so many different directions. I'm not sure the guy ever sleeps. He does so much." We are honored to have someone of Chris's stature, talent, and intelligence join us here at Blue Flamingo. Please join me in welcoming him to our community.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Thank you to Craig, and thanks to all the students and the committee that made it possible for me to come here today. I'm touched to be thinking about not just the victims of COVID-19, but of the hurricane. As I mentioned in a class yesterday, my family lost our house to a hurricane a very long time ago when I was only 5 years old. And so that is an element of nature that has always been a part of my thinking. As I said, everything went except my bedroom, which made for a really interesting way to grow up. So I'm going to also touch on Marvin Bell toward the end of the talk here that Dustin so kindly mentioned. My talk is called Delight Radar on Writing in a Time of Plague. When I was invited to deliver a keynote address for the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival 18 months ago, I imagined I would tell you about my oldest friend, Jamie Babson, who from the age of 6 regaled me with stories about the Bahamas, a place that I have yet to visit. His family owned the Loyalist Cottage on Harbor Island, and his grandfather, Stanley Babson, published a book on bone fishing, which included photographs of a famous local guide, Bonefish Joe. Stanley Babson was the first published author I knew, and perhaps this shaped my writing life. His book offered tangible evidence that it was possible to write about something I loved, fishing, which at the time was my favorite way to spend a summer afternoon. The book contains descriptions of the Bahamas and a comprehensive set of instructions for anyone hoping to catch what he called the, quote, elusive ghosts of the flats. I've never seen a bonefish, but I can picture one in my mind thanks to this book, and I am eager to learn the art of saltwater fly fishing in your archipelago. Harbor Island was a sanctuary for British loyalists after the American Revolution. In my childhood, I learned that stories of the colonists' heroism were more complex than our teachers led us to believe. For I lived near the Wick House in Jockey Hollow, not far from Morristown, New Jersey, George Washington's winter headquarters. The Wick House was the site of a colorful incident during the most consequential insurrection on the road to independence. Suffice to say that support of the revolutionary cause was less than fulsome, as the story of Tempe Wick reveals. She was a young woman on horseback in the harshest winter of the war, when she was accosted by 3 drunken soldiers from the Pennsylvania Brigade, which had revolted over their meager pay. These mutineers wanted her horse. In one version of the story, she told them that they could have it after she rode home. In another, she pretended to dismount, and when the soldier holding the bridle let go, she prodded her horse and galloped home. There she led the horse into her bedroom, tied it to the wall, slid a feather bed under its hooves to muffle any sounds, and shuttered the windows. The soldiers arriving soon after searched for her horse in the barn, the outbuildings, and the woods, never thinking to check in the house. Eventually they gave up and joined the other mutineers, whose rebellion was in due course put down. The war hung in the balance in the winter of 1781, and from my earliest childhood, I was schooled in the knowledge that the course of American history might have gone in a different direction, if not for certain decisions made in a village known to very few of my countrymen. In 1822, a local doctor wrote, quote, "I am more than ever struck with the unparalleled measure of our sufferings, the hairbreadth escapes, the providential interpositions and miraculous preservations, and finally the magnitude of our triumph. To me, it seems like a dream. To posterity, it must appear fabulous," end quote. So it seemed to me, for I was raised on a story which in the manner of a dream was at once fabulous and familiar, of a war effort salvaged at its darkest point by one general's decision to follow his wayward troops until they came to their senses, by George Washington's steadiness throughout the crisis, and by the quick thinking of Tempe Wick. The mutineers remind us that America was divided for a long time before Donald Trump was elected president on a campaign promise to limit immigration and drain the so-called swamp. We have clashed over our conceptions of God, our obligations to the British Crown, slavery, the wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, the proper size of a government, and much more. No wonder some of my countrymen ended up in the Bahamas, where in the 1960s, my best friend caught bonefish in the winter. His family sold the Loyalist Cottage long ago, and in preparing this address, I came upon this tantalizing description of it at www.periodhomes.com. About 1,500 square feet in size, the 2-story gabled house was built in 1797, making it the oldest of the country's loyalist cottages. Situated on land sold by Governor John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, the structures were for refugee Brits resettling amidst the turmoil of the Revolutionary War. Built in the colonial style with tropical influences, they are humble in stature with stick frames and small plots, and together formed a community near the town center. The moral of this story is that poets and writers who are in the business of seeking connections, cultural, historical, and political, between one thing and another, must always be on the lookout for correspondences, the interrogation of which may provide the materials and inspiration for lasting works of literature. How they do this in a pandemic is what I propose to explore with you here. For COVID-19, which has deepened divisions apparent in the New World in general from the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas, and in my country in particular from the Puritan settling of New England in the 17th century, may be only this century's first pandemic. A Chinese research team having recently discovered 24 previously unknown bat coronaviruses within a radius of 4 kilometers in southwestern China. We may glimpse light at the end of this year-long tunnel of disease and death thanks to advances in vaccinology, but Mother Nature likely has more surprises in store for us. Hence this essay in preparing for disaster. Last March, when the novel coronavirus shut everything down, including foreign travel, which in my case was to have begun with this festival, I turned to a book published precisely a century before, William Carlos Williams's magnetic Cora in Hell improvisations, which he wrote during the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, the deadliest in recorded history. About 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population at the time, were infected with the virus, which was first detected in Kansas, not Spain, and as many as 50 million died, on top of the 22 million deaths in the Great War. In short, of military, public health, and social catastrophe, which fed the cultural frenzy of the 1920s. Dada and Surrealism, the Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, all took their cues from the destruction of the old order through war and disease and the birth of the new. Williams memorably described the composition of his book, quote, "I had no book in mind when I began the improvisations. For a year, I used to come home, and no matter how late it was before I went to bed, I would write something. And at the end of the year, there were 365 entries. Even if I had nothing in my mind at all, I put something down. And as may be expected, some of the entries were pure nonsense and were rejected when the time came for publication. They were a reflection of the day's happenings, more or less, and what I had to do with them. Some were unintelligible to a stranger, and I knew that I would have to interpret them. I was groping around to find a way to include the interpretations when I came upon a book Ezra Pound had left in my house, Varie Poesie dell'Abate Pietro Metastasio, published in Venice in 1795. I took the method used by the abbot of drawing a line to separate my material. First came the improvisations, those more or less incomprehensible statements, then the dividing line, and in italics, my interpretations of the improvisations. Thus he generated the first draft by means of automatic writing, the core element of surrealist practice, and borrowed its form from an 18th century cleric's collection of sacred and profane poems, which is to say, he made something new in the time-honored fashion of marrying contemporary materials to an old formal pattern. And this, along with his reading of medical case histories, had a decisive influence on his writing life. In Cora in Hell, he found a way to draw from his deepest self what was most important for him to say, as in this prose poem, which veers from surreal images to the hint of an anecdote, to romantic dreams, to aphorisms, all in the service of his wild imagination. And this goes like this. Beautiful white corpse of night, actually, so the northwest winds of death are mountain sweet after all. All the troubled stars are put to bed now, 3 bullets from wife's hand, none kindlier, in the crown, in the nape, and 1 lower. 3 star-like holes among a million pocky pores, and the moon of your mouth, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, and all stars melted forthwith into this one good white light over the inquest table, the traditional moth beating its wings against it, except there are 2 here. But sweetest are the caresses of the country physician, a little clumsy perhaps, May, and the prosecuting attorney, Peter Valuzzi, and the others waving green arms of maples to the tinkling of the earliest rag pickers' bells. Otherwise, kindly stupid hands, kindly coarse voices, infinitely soothing, infinitely detached, infinitely beside the question, restfully babbling of how, where, why, and night is done, and the green edge of yesterday has said all it could. And here is how Williams interprets this passage. Remorse is a virtue in that it is a stirrer up of the emotions, but it is a folly to accept it as a criticism of conduct. So to accept it is to attempt to fit the emotions of a certain state to a preceding state to which they are in no way related. Imagination, though it cannot wipe out the sting of remorse, can instruct the mind in its proper uses. Williams had plenty of reasons to feel remorse. His roving eye, for example, which may explain his wife's decision not to be buried by his side. The outlines of his story about a crime of passion, a wife murdering her husband, seem tinged with guilt, and his interpretation of the promptings from his unconscious, inflected in a variety of linguistic possibilities, veering between different registers and diction, smacks of the kind of self-justification that all sinners know. What is the green edge of yesterday? The American decision to enter the Great War in April 1917 shook Williams, who wrote in his autobiography that, quote, the newness of a springtime, which I had sensed among the others, a reawakening of letters, all that delight which in the making of a world to match the supremacies of the past could mean was being blotted out by the war. My year, myself was being slaughtered. What was the use of denying it? Close quote. Add to that the ravages of the pandemic, and the poet's dream of salving his soul comes clear. Cora in Hell is his declaration of independence from those who are unwilling to examine the meaning of, quote, the profound change that has come upon them, which he delineates in this poem from Spring and Awe. By the road to the contagious hospital, under the surge of the blue mottled clouds driven from the northeast, a cold wind. Beyond, the waste of breath, muddy fields brown with dried weeds, standing and falling, patches of standing water, the scattering of tall trees. All along the road, the reddish purplish forked upstanding twiggy stuff of bushes and small trees with dead brown leaves under them, leafless vines. Lifeless in appearance, sluggish, dazed spring approaches. They enter the new world naked, cold, uncertain of all save that they enter. All about them, the cold, familiar wind. Now the grass, tomorrow the stiff curl of wild carrot leaf. One by one, objects are defined. It quickens, clarity, outline of leaf. But now the stark dignity of entrance, still the profound change has come upon them. Rooted, they grip down and begin to awaken. Not long after rereading Cora in Hell, I discovered Ellen Bryant Voigt's Kyria, a book-length sonnet sequence recreating voices lost in the 1918 pandemic, which has as an epigraph a line from Alfred Crosby's America's Forgotten Pandemic, the influenza of 1918, and it goes like this. Nothing else, no infection, no war, no famine has ever killed so many in so short a time. Voigt honors voices lost to history, and in this way, she takes issue with the statement often attributed to Joseph Stalin. A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. The poet draws our attention to the individual nature of tragedy, commemorating each loss with such vivid imagery and language that we may begin to comprehend the true dimensions of that pandemic. And the first of the sonnets I want to read for you goes like this. To be brought from the bright schoolyard into the house, to stand by her bed like an animal stunned in the pen, against the grid of the quilt, her hand seems stitched to the cuff of its sleeve, although he wants most urgently the hand to stroke his head, although he thinks he could kneel down, that it would need to travel only inches to brush like a breath his flushed cheek. He doesn't stir. All his resolve, all his resources go to watching her. Her mouth, her hair a pillow of blackened ferns. He means to match her stillness bone for bone. Nearby, he hears the younger children cry, and his aunts, like careless thieves, out in the kitchen. Here is a tableau vivant in the form of a death watch, the grievous emotions of which are enacted in the very syntax and movement of each line, the first 12 of which consist of a single sentence, each clause gathering weight, as if the language itself is in suspension for the husband who means to match her stillness bone for bone. The rhythm alternates between regular blank verse lines and shorter or longer variations on that until the final 5 lines, which are nearly perfect pentameters, foreshadowing the perfect stillness of the grave. The next sonnet in the sequence can be read as a refrain or an answer to the tableau vivant. This is the double bed where she'd been born, bed of her mother's marriage and decline, bed her sisters ripened in, bed that drew her husband to her side, bed for her 1 child lost and 5 delivered, bed indifferent to the many bodies, bed around which all of them were gathered, watery shapes in the shadows of the room, and the bed frail abroad the violent ocean, the frightened beasts so clumsy and pathetic, heaving their wet breath against her neck. She threw off the pile of quilts, white face like a moon, and then entered straightway into heaven. This double bed, which appears in each of the first 7 lines, is the organizing principle of the poem and of life. Note how dexterously Voigt manages variations from the regular iambic pentameter, offering 5 straight headless lines, 2 through 7, to reinforce the looming loss, a prosodic device she repeats in the final line, which comes from the King James version of the Gospel of Mark. And straightway going up from the water, he saw the heavens parting asunder. It is a tour de force, which I have returned to again and again during this pandemic, mindful of the decision by the editors of the New York Times to use the front page of the paper on the occasion of the first 1,000 deaths from COVID-19 to print their names. One day, a poet will write a Kyria for some of the victims of this pandemic. And Kyria means Lord have mercy. A word about the title of this talk, which comes from the introduction to the Book of Delights by Ross Gay, which was published in 2019, just in time for the coronavirus. Ross decided to write a short essay every day for a year about something delightful. Think of this as an answer to William Carlos Williams's Cora in Hell, except that the subject is not the language, gorgeous as Ross's language is, but delight, perhaps the most difficult subject to keep in mind during this lockdown. And that is why this book has been my constant companion this year. Ross writes, "It didn't take long to learn that the discipline or practice of writing these essays occasioned a kind of delight radar. Or maybe it was more like the development of a delight muscle, something that implies that the more you study delight, the more delight there is to study. A month or two into this project, delights were calling to me, write about me, write about me. Because it is rude not to acknowledge your delights, I tell them that though they might not become essayettes, they were still important and I was grateful to them. Which is to say, I felt my life to be more full of delight, not without sorrow or fear or pain or loss, but more full of delight. I also learned this year that my delight grows, much like love and joy, when I share it." I don't have time to read one of his essays, which he wrote quickly in longhand, beginning and ending on his birthday, but I can urge you to find and read this book as soon as you can. It will change your life, because it turns out that we all have a delight radar, which may not work that well in this pandemic, but we can find writing practices to school our imaginations in the art of paying attention to every moment. And so I wish to close by reading 4 prose paragraphs from the 2nd and 3rd volumes of a book titled After the Fact, which the poet Marvin Bell and I wrote back and forth until his death in December. Marvin's shaping influence on my life dates from the summer of 1978, when I studied with him at the Breadloaf Writers Conference. Ever since, his poems, essays, and interviews have schooled me in the art of poetry and the intricacies of the creative process. Our friendship began in earnest some years later when he took a sabbatical leave in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my wife and I were caretakers of a small estate on the edge of the National Forest. Marvin called me nearly every morning at 8:30 to talk, gossip, joke, and banters, calls I came to regard as invaluable lessons in the art of poetry, which begins with listening. I am grateful for the chance to listen to him. I was grateful for the chance to listen to him. Then and there, a seed was planted for what grew into a fruitful collaboration. Ours was inspired by his earlier partnership with William Stafford, which produced a wonderful book titled Segways and a fine press edition, Annie Over. Stafford wrote, "Marvin Bell is easy to interchange with. Like a prism, he accepts whatever comes at him and reflects it in rainbows," close quote. This was my experience too, first in the group poem collaboration we undertook in 2007 to celebrate the International Writing Program's 40th anniversary, 7 poets, 4 days, 1 book. And then in the exchange of prose poems, or paras as we called them, collected in After the Fact, the first volume of which, Scripts and Postscripts, was published in 2016. The second volume, If and When, we finished in the first days of the pandemic, and a third volume, Here and Now, was in the works when Marvin died. For close to 10 years, we probed our memories, teased out the meaning of various public and private events, bore witness to our separate walks in the sun. Nothing excited me more in literary terms than this exploration, and Marvin seemed to feel the same. "I love receiving each new para from you," he wrote 10 days before his death. regarding my latest installment in Here and Now, it defines the immediate future. My para concerned a romantic betrayal dating from the year I first met Marvin. And now he went on to say he had experienced something similar when he was stationed at Fort Bragg, which made me think he was already contemplating his next para. A few hours later, he sent me a final one-word message, heartbreaking. Sometime after that, he suffered a heart attack from which he did not recover. He was surrounded by his family on the night he died, and the stereo was playing Chet Baker's You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To. Marvin never missed a beat. And so I'm going to read you two of these paras from the book If and When, and then I'll read you two from Here and Now. And the first is by Marvin. It's called Aesthetic Wobble Number 6. We wrote, all told, 219 of these paras, and one of the themes that Marvin returned to from time to time was what he called an aesthetic wobble. And some of these works had dates to them. This one was dated March 28th, 2020. Can we vindicate our yearning for beauty during a pandemic? Is there a writer's hazmat suit? Beginning to write at 2:30 in the afternoon, I noted the count of 116,448 coronavirus cases in the US and 1,943 deaths. When I quickly reloaded the page, I saw that someone else had passed. By 2:41, the death toll was 1,978. Now, Trump wants people to die for the Dow. New York City Mayor Andrew Cuomo, during our pandemic, the most presidential spokesman in the country, having asked in vain for sufficient federal assistance while New Yorkers perished, now could not keep from calling Trump's plan to get people into the streets by Easter, quote, not inspirational, but asinine, close quote. Trump has told his sycophantic VP Mike Pence not to telephone governors insufficiently appreciative of him. I am bent from concern for my son and daughter-in-law residing on the 26th floor of a Brooklyn high-rise. He reassures me. We take the stairs down and up, he says. Nobody takes the stairs in New York. Taking a break from writing this at 4 p.m., the US death toll stands at 1,979. 1 minute later, 1,993. Trumpism is exponential. And here's how I answered him the next day. This is called The True Believer. March 29, 2020. On my mother's birthday, 1 month to the day after her death, I counted out the pills remaining in my supply of hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malarial drug used in the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, to gauge how long I might have before my immune system resumed its attack on my joints. A Trump tweet extolling its miraculous healing properties for sufferers of COVID-19 led to a shortage of the drug, with doctors prescribing it for themselves and their families, and so the pharmacy cannot refill my prescription. The president's faith in a single study dismissed by virologists unnerved public health professionals accustomed to making policy recommendations based on scientific evidence. And his followers' belief in the misinformation he offers daily about the pandemic, despite media fact-checking, called to mind the true believer, Eric Hoffer's study of mass movements and fanaticism, which once helped me understand my mother's trust in Richard Nixon. The stevedore wrote his first book in longhand between shifts on the San Francisco docks, then sent his only copy to Harvard University Press. When asked what he would do if the editor lost his manuscript, he said he would just write it out again because he had it memorized. The true believer is everywhere on the march, he wrote in 1951, and this is still the case. My mother died of dementia on Leap Day, the date of the first American death from COVID-19. And since I last checked this morning, the plague has claimed 172 more lives. Medical supplies are running dangerously low in New York City, and Trump is boasting on Twitter about the television ratings his press conferences garner. If and when this finally comes to an end, I hope that what we have written here and what we may yet write will be at once original and true. And then several months later, toward the very end of our partnership, I wrote this piece. It's called Miss Sarajevo. The story may be apocryphal, how Luciano Pavarotti awakened at dawn by workers renovating the hotel next to his in Portland, Oregon, went outside in his bathrobe to ask the foreman what it would cost for his crew to take the day off. The foreman made a quick calculation, $24,000. The tenor handed him a wad of $100 bills and said, "I need my sleep," which was my first thought early one morning that spring, when Serbian artillery in the mountains around Sarajevo began to shell the neighborhood where I was staying. I hurried down to the basement of the house rented to an NGO, and while I took notes on the stories and conversations of different people arriving and departing when there was a lull in the shooting, in another basement in the city, Bosnian women competed in the misbesieged Sarajevo contest under a banner reading, "Don't let them kill us." This dark humor inspired a documentary film and a song composed by Bono and Brian Eno, which U2 debuted at Pavarotti's annual benefit concert in his hometown of Modena, Italy. The concert, which he dedicated to the children of Bosnia, was a glitzy affair that drew celebrities like Princess Diana to hear him add a solo to Miss Sarajevo, a mournful blend of pop music and opera. The YouTube video of the song, which includes footage of a man sprinting across Sniper Alley, the contestants in bathing suits, and the National Library in flames, has 17 million views. The winner of the contest, Inela Nogic, who might have been mistaken for Diana's younger sister, lives now in the Netherlands. Not long ago, she accused the band of profiting for 25 years from that video. "Wouldn't it have been decent to pay us for that?" she asked. And here's Marvin's answer to it, and it's called The Future. The time-worn movie house in our small town showed films only on weekends. Small business owners like my father were given tickets to hand out. I no longer remember the gimmick, which might have been that each free ticket required a paid companion, since rarely would anyone go to a movie alone. Movies were for dates and families. Matinees, when the lights went down, someone would throw open the exit door near the front. While the light from the alley washed away the screen, a dozen kids would pour in, scattering into seats so that the usher could find and expel only one or two. Double features were common, along with previews, news, a short subject, a cliff-hanging serial, and a cartoon. And there was sometimes more: the annual raffle of Thanksgiving turkeys or a talent show, the volume of applause determining the winners. Usually there was a boyfriend whistling and shouting for his favorite. The contestants were solidly amateur in a community characterized by polka combos and singers who could MC wedding receptions. The just betrothed honeymooned at places they could drive to, Bear Mountain, Niagara Falls. As they drove away, cardboard signs flapping against the trunk and tin cans dragging from the rear bumper, every car honked. How long ago? The only bathing beauty shows were modest films from Atlantic City. No sleazy Trump pageants, nor a tweet for a president. Such behavior was inconceivable. The future always is, and here we are, here and now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I guess I'll open it up to any questions. If I didn't see any pop up in the chat, but if anybody has any questions for Chris, please feel free to ask them. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is just kind of, I mean, it was so nice to hear you discuss Marvin and his work. I know it's kind of amazing how many generations of writers he influenced and taught in his time. I mean, it's a laundry list of some of the biggest names in poetry. And I had the exact same experience as a young writer at 19, taking my first workshop, and who should walk in the door but Marvin. And he's like, and he said, I'm gonna guest teach this class. I've got nothing else to do. And it was, I mean, he knocked our socks off and dragged us through the dirt and, you know, made us into much better writers. It was really incredible. And it was just so sad to hear of him go. And it was, I guess it was last year, not earlier this year, but so thank you for that. So my question, I guess the first question would be, because the pandemic has driven us inward, has driven us indoors, has driven our minds, you know, half out of themselves. And I wanted to try to parallel this idea with the public and the private, because I think that being driven indoors and, you know, not being as social as we normally would be, yet here we are online, you know, meeting and talking in really opening up these forums to far more people than might normally be attending. And so I wanted to try to connect that to the idea of writing and the idea of, for you as a writer and a translator and so many different genres, how do you balance the need for the privacy in writing, the composition and all of that, versus the idea of making that public? I mean, is there a sensibility that you have, or a kind of method that you feel works? Because, you know, you're always writing for yourself and for a public, otherwise it's just a diary.
That's a terrific and possibly unanswerable question, but it's the kind of question that Marvin would pose too, wouldn't it? Isn't it? And I'll say that the interesting thing about the book that Marvin and I, the first one that we did, Postscripts and Postscripts, was that I was always traveling abroad. Marvin was traveling between Iowa City and a summer house they had in Port Townsend, Washington. But I would be sending back these paras from Kazakhstan, from from China, from the Congo, all the different places that my job took me. And there was always an element of political reportage in what we were writing, because both Marvin and I take a keen interest in politics, and it's important to remember that we wrote the first book. We published the first book just at the end of the Obama administration, which had one kind of presented us with one kind of way of being in the world, and we decided to keep writing. I think in part because we knew that we were entering a completely different world in the Trump administration. And so that brought us to a place that when the pandemic started, I think we had this third realization, which was, gee, now we're all stuck at home. Our contact with the outside world is via the media, and thank God, Zoom events, which have, as you rightly point out, made so many different kinds of encounters possible that would heretofore have been unimaginable. And since we were kind of stuck in the same place, the conversation took on an increasingly political turn. Now, I'm conscious as I say that you know, when you try to write about politics, as W.H. Auden said, that's the place where it begins to stink first, because the political piece starts to fall apart. When I was writing about the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia, I was reading and rereading George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. He went and he was part of the Spanish Civil War, and when you read that book, the physical descriptions, the dialogue, it's all fantastic. The place where you start to nod off is when it starts dealing with political stuff, and so that's the danger, is that if you invoke a political figure or a political argument, it's likely to go sour before long. So that's why I would say there's no method. You're just trying to hope to find ways to describe what's going on that you imagine might continue to have meaning after that political moment passes. I think after the 4 years of Donald Trump, people are going to be writing about this for a very long time to come. I noted yesterday that more than 1,000 books have been published about the Trump presidency already, and we're only 2 months into the Biden administration. So that these big historical events, people write about them forever. And that's why I was so interested in the Ellen Bryant Voigt book, because she wrote it 25 years ago, but it feels so contemporary to me now. And I, as I was reading and rereading, and I was thinking, some point down the road, something like someone will think to write something like that for all the millions of victims of COVID-19.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought her up. And I mean, as well as Homage to Catalonia, for whatever reason, my mind always drifts back to that passage where he's been shot in the throat. Yeah. It's just describing how beautiful the trees are. And, it's just almost this out of body experience. And it's a fascinating book, but you're exactly right. The moment he starts to skew too politically, and I think that happens in all literature, when you come at it ideologically, it basically pins the poem to the ground. And it can't be any more free than the constraints you put on it.
But that's why there's that great scene after he gets shot in the neck by a sniper. He's in a hospital, and you'll remember this, where a friend comes to say to him, you got shot in the neck. You're lucky to have survived. You must be the luckiest man in the world to survive. And Orwell quips, I could not help feeling that it would be even luckier not to have been shot at all. And in a way, that's how you write about these things. You have a sense of humor. You bring out the really human moments in that.
And it's funny because he was actually a very funny writer, but it was just so subdued, so British.
Yeah.
We do have a question from one of the English department faculty, Dr. Christine Kozakowski. She says, I love the connection that you make between historical text and your creative work. Can you talk a little more about how that influences you in your process?
That's a really great question. And maybe I'll invoke Marvin. Marvin would say, how to be a writer? Read a poem, write a poem. Read a poem, write a poem. And when we did the first book we did together, 7 Poets, 4 Days, 1 Book, he said it's important to have source materials around, which is to say other books. And every writer comes out of the writers that he or she has read. So, I think I'm like a lot of writers in that I'd probably prefer to read than to write. The reading part is a really great thing. And then, of course, now you've got to write. But so much of what I do as a writer comes out of my reading. I'm just now thinking of the wonderful poet Norman Dubie, who years ago I published a book of his aphorisms. And one of them goes like this. I am a professional reader and an amateur writer. When I become an amateur reader, I'm too lazy to be a writer. And the point is that if you're going to be any kind of a writer, you have to be a professional reader. You're going to read the books that will inspire you, that will instruct you, that will give you a sense of how other writers have done, have solved aesthetic problems at different points in history. And that's why I turned, at the beginning of the pandemic, I turned to Cora and Hell. I thought, that's right. How did Williams deal with this? Well, he started basically doing automatic writing every day as a way to keep his sanity. And out of that experience, he was able to make a book. So, I look to all my elders, and there are many of them working in many different languages, and so that's how I hope that answers the question for you.
Thank you. Since you mentioned all these other languages and you mentioned your travels, I mean, because of your work with UNESCO and because of your work with the International Writing Program, you've traveled to, I think you said, over 50 countries?
Well, I've done more than 50 countries on cultural diplomacy missions. Yeah, probably close to about 100 countries altogether.
Wow, okay.
So, yeah.
Burning through your passport, all the stamps.
Yeah.
Can you talk maybe a little bit about the importance of these kind of cultural exchanges and maybe how literature is kind of the passport? I mean, because it transcends space and time. I mean, we can read Gilgamesh, for example, and still have a glimpse into their views of life. And so can you talk a little bit about how translation or these kinds of cultural exchanges and writing itself and art really does, or how important that is as a product? Because, we're trying to start this creative writing program here at UB, get our young writers, give them the skills of craft and all of that so that they can get their work out, get it published, and have it seen by other people in other countries.
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe I'll answer it by talking a little bit about the thing I've been working on between writing this address this week. I've been dealing with the situation in Myanmar, Burma, because we've had the good luck in the International Writing Program to host about 25 poets and writers from Myanmar during the time I've been here. And two of them have been detained by the police. One of them has been severely beaten in jail. And so I found trying to think about, in another life, I might have had almost no knowledge at all about Myanmar. But because of this job, I got to travel there back in 2004 in the very darkest days of the military junta. And I met writers who were just struck me as being some of the bravest people I'd ever known. There was one writer in particular who she was a doctor, had gone to prison for, she was given a 20-year prison sentence, basically for her writings and for her close ties to Aung San Suu Kyi, who would then become the equivalent of the president in Burma much, much later. And I met with her we went to a Thai restaurant for dinner one night, and she was telling me about being in prison. And they referred to, she and the other inmates referred to books as vitamins. That was their code for how a book could help you live your life, right? And she was a doctor. At one point, she realized she had tuberculosis, and she could not get any help. So what did she do? She went on a hunger strike, and eventually the regime had to let her go. A few years after that, we were able to bring her to Iowa City, and I was on she and I were on a radio program together, and we were talking about how, what she'd done as a writer. And it just occurred to me to say, so how did you make it through each day? You couldn't write. They wouldn't give them any paper or anything to write on. You could only get books smuggled in, the vitamins. And she said, well, I'm a Buddhist. And so I meditated some days 18, 20 hours a day. And when she left, when she was released, she said to the guard, she thanked the guards for giving her the time and the space to practice her religion. And I think about that, her doing that, weekly. I've thought about that weekly since then, because what she was doing, I think, was telling us something about how you live your life. No matter how awful it is, there are ways, like as Ross Gay talks about with his delight radar. I mean, she wasn't looking for delight. She was trying to figure out how to survive this terrible thing. And now she's the president of the newly reformed Myanmar Pen Association, and she's obviously in great danger in Myanmar. I'm just waiting every day. Every email I get from that part of the world, I think, oh my God, I hope she hasn't been swept up. But some of our other writers, are in hiding. And so part of what my job, I think, the last few weeks has been to try to see what we can do to generate interest in this cause, to see if we can't help bring pressure to bear on the Burmese military regime. They've detained over 2,000 people, more than 220 people have been killed. The police are using water cannons and, rubber bullets, but also snipers with live ammunition. And this is what it is. This is where we are in the world right now. So when you think about the talks that the new Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had in Alaska the last couple of days with his Chinese counterparts, surely one of the things they were discussing was the situation in Myanmar. And insofar as writers can band together to help highlight injustices and oppression and other kinds of things around the world, that's one of the ways in which we become more upright citizens of the world, I think. And then the final thing I just would say is it's a lot of fun to be with writers from other countries and see how they live their lives. We all have basically the same problems, what to do with the blank page, right? And what to do when you would really rather read than write. And, and then we can bitch and moan about the other things we usually do, that writers don't get paid enough, and there's, and they never get the prizes that they think you should get. That's all part of it too. So.
I think it's a really good point, and it's something that's so easy to forget, coming from an American context and all the workshops, or in the Bahamas, where we're free to have writing workshops. We're free to write a poem. I mean, there are plenty of places where that's illegal. I mean, they're practically the first people purged. If you think about Pol Pot or Stalin, I mean, they go after the intellectuals, they go after the writers, because that vision, the ability to inspire and all of that, and the ability to create works that outlast the time period in which they're written. So I think it's an excellent point.
And it makes me think that one of my favorite poets, a poet I translated extensively, was the Slovenian poet Tomáš Šalamun, who was in our program back in the early 70s for a couple of years. He had grown up, was a conceptual artist and a poet. And when he was 23, 24 years old, he was thrown in jail by the Yugoslav authorities because he was the editor of a prominent cultural magazine. And enough pressure was brought to bear by the New York Times, by the International Herald Tribune, that he was released after 5 days. But so he got out, he was out of prison, but he couldn't find work. He was forbidden to work by the Yugoslav authorities. And he told me a story once that I just treasure about that. He couldn't get a job, so he started selling books door to door. And but he was a terrible salesman because he was a poet, and he was really, kind of a as Marvin would say, someone from Mars, right? And he came up to this one door and knocked on it, and the woman answered and said, "I'm not interested in the kinds of books you're selling." And he was selling encyclopedias and how-to books and things like that. And she said to him, I only like to read Proust, Kafka, and Šalamun." And he looked at her and he said, "I am Šalamun." And in my program, so he couldn't get any work, so he ended up in the international writing program and stayed for a couple of years as a way of giving him a space to do his work. And poets started translating him. And then in about 1980, 81, Robert Hass put together a big anthology of his work with and Charlie Simic. And suddenly he became a really influential poet for younger American poets on my life, for sure. And that's the way in which a conversation can begin in a tiny little language. Slovenia is spoken by only maybe 2 million people in the world. It's a tiny country, maybe the size of Connecticut. You can drive across all of Slovenia in 2 hours. But there we have this language, we have this bond forged in poetry across the different languages. So I think that's the gift of literature.
Yeah. When I was an undergrad, he was definitely like a force among all the young writers, and everybody was reading him. And I think it's an excellent point. If I can ask a technical question.
Yeah.
As the director of the International Writing Program, can you just sketch in, how the program works? And perhaps if we have any Bahamian authors who might be interested in applying for a space at the IWP, how does it work? Your aims, the goals, the funding opportunities and stuff like that, so that we can sketch that in.
So the International Writing Program was founded in 1967, and it has been funded to a considerable degree ever since by the US State Department. And what happens in the winter, every year, the Secretary of State sends out what's called a cable offering to all the embassies and consulates around the world, inviting them to nominate writers for the IWP, that's what we call it. And the requirements to be nominated, you have to have published at least one book. We look for writers who have achieved at some level of national acclaim and perhaps international acclaim. And our design is, from our perspective, we want as diverse a group of writers from as many different countries as we possibly can. So next fall, in the fall, we will bring 38 writers from 36 countries, every continent, all ages. We've had writers as young as 24 and as old as 71, and they're at different levels of at different points in their career. We've had a couple of Nobel Prize winners, like the novelist Orhan Pamuk from Turkey, and the Chinese novelist Mo Yan. Pamuk wrote, I think, his breakthrough book while he was in Iowa, a book called The Black Book, and that was the one where he really became Orhan Pamuk. Mo Yan had already written many well-known books by the time he came to our program, but we're on the lookout for writers who are doing something really interesting in their work, all genres. We hope that what we look for are writers who would be open to being in an intense conversation with writers from around the world over 3 months. We always have, for example, a writer from Israel and a Palestinian writer in residence at the same time. They completely disagree on political matters, but they often become friends, because they share the same space and food and climate. And in that respect, I think we had a writer many years ago, Dorit Rabinian, Israeli novelist, and I was driving her somewhere, and that year's Palestinian had arrived late because of visa issues he was having. And so as I was driving her, I said, "So have you gotten to know Mohammed very well?" And she said, "Yeah, he screamed at me for 90 minutes straight, and now we're okay." But here's the kicker, is that then the writers, they have a travel period at the end of the residency, and Dorit had an apartment in New York City, or she had access to it, and Mohammed something went awry with his hotel reservation. He ended up spending that time in New York in her apartment. Flash go forward 10 years, she's got a novel about an Israeli writer or falling in love with a Palestinian writer. And the novel was a huge bestseller. And yeah, I'm not saying anything happened, but I'm saying that she could see the possibilities there and chose to explore them in a novel that has just won plaudits all around the world. So.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, thank you. If there are any other questions, please feel free to ask. And drop those in the chat.
The first writer from Myanmar I mentioned her name is Ma Thida, Thida. I think I can just spell it here. She's got one book in English translation that you can track down.
Yeah, it was really, it's really great to have you here because we had discussed having you down for the last Blue Flamingo, and it was all in the works and everything was happening, and then all of a sudden it all ended. So I would really love even to have you back next year physically.
Yeah.
And
so I should have mentioned one thing. For a Bahamian writer to be in the IWP, they would simply have to make their interest known to the U.S. Embassy there, and the cable will go out next winter, and so Bahamian writers who've got at least one book, that's possible. And I can say that since I'm not sure we've ever actually had a writer, we may have had one writer from the Bahamas, so we have kind of an internal thing with all of us, which is we want writers from countries that we haven't had many writers from. So that's part of what we look for.
I remember you mentioning that last year when we were talking about it, and you said that to your memory, you couldn't remember that you'd had a Bahamian writer. So
not in my time. Yeah.
That would be a really great opportunity.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of collaboration? Because in talking with some of the students, and especially younger writers and nascent writers, and kind of struggling with the idea of, like we were talking about earlier, this idea of the private versus the public, because going into a workshop the first time, you and I have forgotten those jitters of the first workshop, but it is very shocking to walk in, read your poem out loud, and then have to remain silent while everybody is like, I don't like this line, and what's this word? And so can you talk a little bit about but that's collaboration, right?
Yeah.
And that's necessary to have that public. Can you talk a little bit about having worked with Marvin, who was super funny and super smart, and also kind of ornery at times, and could express his opinion vociferously, and just how that process came about, or I guess you explained that, but more like how it influenced your writing, even the process of collaboration. Translations are also a form of collaboration, so to speak. And so if you can just talk a little bit about that and your methods and process.
Yeah, well, a sense of humor helps. I'm just, as you were saying that, I was thinking that a workshop I took with him when he was a visiting poet at the University of Washington, where I was getting my master's. There was a guy in the class. He was like an old salty, retired Navy guy. He'd been 20 years in Navy, and now he'd been in every port. And during the time of this class, he had fallen in love with a much younger woman who was a born-again Christian. And so he actually would, one night a week, they would get together to read the Bible. And if you knew this guy, you would think that's really probably not where he's going. and so he wrote a poem, which was a pretty atrocious poem about how he would make love to this woman whenever he got the chance. And he read it aloud, and there was a kind of stunned silence. It began with, I would do it slowly, and it goes on like that. And in that silence, after it was over, Marvin said, promises. And the poet he just burst into laughter because, he kind of knew he'd written a terrible poem, but Marvin's humor had in a way said, okay, look, you wrote a lousy poem, but that's not a reflection on your life. It's just that poem isn't so great. And we write a lot of bad poems, but bad sentences on the way we hope to writing a better one. And that's part of what goes on in the workshop model. And, I'm also thinking what I taught with Marvin at a writers conference in Jackson Hole one year. And every night we'd go to a Mexican restaurant, and over dinner and margaritas, we would dream up an exercise to write the next day in class. And so for the last class, I remember the night before, we kind of run out of all the exercise ideas we had. And we decided we'll bring in 2 hats. In one hat, we'll have slips of paper with different fruits and vegetables. And in the other hat, place names. And then we'd have the students take out one from each and write a poem about it. And Marvin's Marvin's motto, as you'll recall, was teacher does the exercise, right? As a way of showing to the students that we're all human, we're all capable of writing less than stellar stuff, especially on command. And I remember I got mangoes and Alaska, and the woman sitting next to me got something and Moscow. And she didn't want Moscow, but I heard mangoes in Moscow. And I said, well, let's just trade. I'll take Moscow, you can have Alaska. And I wrote a poem of about 1 page long. When I went home, I knew there was something more there. It ended up being a poem of about 18 pages. It's the last poem in my book, Brilliant Water. And it came out of just what seems like an arbitrary exercise. But in that exercise, the great thing about a writing exercise is that the imagination is like the sea, and it can go any direction. And you need to find a way through it. And a writing exercise can be one way to cut a channel through that sea. And if you take it seriously, something interesting might come out of it. And that's part of giving oneself over to the materials, whether as a writer or as a translator or as a member of a workshop. We're all in this together. And my general feeling is a sense of humor helps, and a sense of humility in the face of the task, and that we're there to try to help one another write better works.
Absolutely. And that's what, we're all trying to do through these workshops and through discussions like this, and inspire students, inspire one another, point to authors maybe we haven't heard of, maybe ones we should be reading, maybe ones we know we need to read that are avoiding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can you perhaps, I guess, tell us an exercise that maybe a young poet or a young person interested in translation, maybe one that you've found useful in the past for your students or yourself?
Well, oftentimes, if I go in to teach just a one-off workshop, I will take a book, whatever book I might be reading at that time, and then just open to a random page, and just my eye will light on a few different words. I'll fly through and come up with 5 or 6 words that just something goes in my imagination when I look at them. And then I'll give the 5 or 6 words and say, write a 15-line poem with those words. And it comes from an exercise that Marvin would give that he got from Theodore Roethke to get into a class, into his workshop. You'd have to write I think it was a 10-line poem with 5 or 6 words. And Marvin's example was that Tess Gallagher at the time was 18 years old. She wanted to be in his workshop, and one of the words was drugstore, and one of the words was horse. She basically got all the words into the poem by titling it "The Horse in the Drugstore," and then the first line, "wants to be admired." And it was such an imaginative use of this that Bretke thought, okay, yeah, you've got it. You have a playful imagination, and you know, the rest is history. She's gone on to become one of our, you know, one of our great poets, and the widow of one of our great story writers, Raymond Carver. Yeah. Can you give some recommendations budding writers should be aware of? Well, you know, one writer I would urge you to read, because he's from Jamaica, is Kai Miller, K-E-I Miller. If you don't know his novels or his shorts or his poems, he's a really fantastic writer who I keep reading a great deal. And some of these are younger writers. I'm thinking of, there's a Russian novelist who was in our program named Alisa Ganieva, G-A-N-I-E-V-A. She's got a book called The Mountain and the Wall, a novel called The Mountain and the Wall, and a second one called Bride and Bridegroom. And she has a really great story. I met her in Moscow years ago, and the story was this: she went to a writing program. You know, we often say the Iowa Writers Workshop was the first writing program in the world. Actually, it was the second. The first one was the Maxim Gorky Literature Institute in Moscow, and it started just a couple of years before the Writers Workshop. But it's turned out a lot of great writers, and one of them was Alisa Ganieva. She went there and came out as a kind of cultural critic and literary critic. And then she wanted to write a novel. She comes from Dagestan, and she wrote a novel that it just tells the story of one young Dagestani male is walking around the capital one day. It's just a day in the life of a young Dagestani male. And she published it under a male pseudonym, and entered it in what was at the time the most important literary contest. It was called the Debut Prize. I think something like 70,000 entries. And her book, her novella, won it. And there was a lag time between the announcement of the winner and the ceremony to give the prize of about a couple of months. And for Moscow literary critics, there was a lot of interest. Who is this, you know, who is this young Dagestani male writer? And they set up a dummy email account for her to answer, to do interviews online or whatever. And as Alisa told me, that she got many, let's say, come-ons from female journalists, imagining that they were talking to, as she would say, a virile Dagestani male. And then they had the big award ceremony. It was like a black tie affair, and they announced the winner, and up steps not a young Dagestani male, but a very beautiful young Dagestani woman, and that just, sent everybody into spasms of literary scandal. And that was the beginning of her career. And she's gone on to write these really terrific books. The newest book is coming out in English translation, is called Offended Sensibilities, or Offended Feelings. So she's a writer I like quite a lot. I mentioned Mo Yan. The novel Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out is one of the funniest novels I've read in a long time. It's a kind of a portrait of China from the time of the revolution in 1948 until the present. And what happens in that novel is a landlord gets murdered and ends up in the underworld, and he's so upset, he shouldn't have been killed, and he's pleading with the lord of the underworld to be allowed to go back, and they do all these crazy things to him, and finally the lord of the underworld says, okay, so you can go back, but you'll go back as a donkey. And he goes back as a donkey and eventually gets killed, and he goes back as a donkey, as a pig, as a cow, as a horse, and finally as something like a young Mo Yan. And it's a deviously cunning novel, and very, very funny. So, there's another writer that I'm thinking about quite a lot these days.
Can you type that author's name out, and then the Russian woman, or the Dagestani woman?
Yeah, Mo Yan is the Chinese writer, and Alisa Ganieva.
Thank you. This will give me something to look forward to.
August Town by Kai Miller. That's his really
yeah, he's good.
Yeah, I like his.
Well, before we wrap up here, I first of all want to ask if there are any other questions, especially from students, I mean, I see some of my students here on the list, and if you have any questions that you want to pose about writing in general, books in general, before we let Chris go. Maybe they're just typing very slowly, using their words very carefully.
So, what would you say is your all-time favorite novel? Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, you know, writers, you have one favorite novel from one day to the next, and they're always changing. I will say that one novel I am always going back to is, well, I guess I'm the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment are two Dostoevsky novels that I read and reread and reread. And Proust's In Search of Lost Time. These are writers that if I read 3 or 4 sentences, I just want to write. I read Kafka quite a lot. I was in a thing yesterday and we got to talking about Bruno Schulz, the wonderful Polish artist and writer who was killed by the Nazis in 1942. He wrote a book called The Street of Crocodiles, which is really, it's a great book of stories. I read that a lot. Milan Kundera is a writer who I just am always learning things from as I read him. And so the poet Yvonne Boland, the Irish poet who was in my program back in the late 70s, she passed away just about a year ago. She's a poet that I'm reading. Yeah. She went on to direct the creative writing program at Stanford. Just a fantastic poet. Same with Seamus Heaney, and yeah. But now I'm going from fiction to poetry. I'll go back to, I'll give you some more prose too.
There's one more question, I think, and then we'll wrap up. But I thank you, Riche, for your question. What novels would you recommend for upcoming writers? Because like some of the novels you just listed here are, I mean, absolutely books that, a human being should read at least once, but especially a writer. But these are like the heavy hitters. You go into Recherche de Temps Perdu and, you're like, what is going on? And Brothers Karamazov, I mean, that's a tough book, but like more like an accessible book. I mean, Kundera, I think, might actually be a kind of fairly good writer for a younger.
Yeah, especially The Unbearable Lightness of Being, because then you can go watch the fantastic film that Milos Forman did with Juliette Binoche and Daniel Day-Lewis. It's a very painterly film, and Kundera is a very funny writer. So I love reading that. For younger writers. The South African writer J.M. Coetzee, his novels in the Waiting for the Barbarians, short novels that are beautifully written, but also give you a picture of, it's always important to read the first novels of lots of different writers to see all the mistakes they make as they're learning their craft, and so I'm always I go back to those early books of his too. So Nadine Gordimer, the other South African writer, the second South African, third to win the Nobel Prize, she wrote a novel called July's People that I really love.
Oh. Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
Good luck with this one. How has writing changed your life, and where would you be were you to never have ever written?
Wow. Well, the thing is,
Good question.
I had two dreams growing up. I wanted to be a professional soccer player, and I wanted to be a poet. I mean, two incredibly stupid things, according to my father, who was a banker, and I did play soccer through college, and I coached for a year at the college level. And if I had never written, I might have ended up as a soccer coach. I worked a lot as a gardener and as a caretaker. I might have ended up doing that. It's funny because when I was a young writer, I was afraid to fly. So travel was not something that was even interesting to me. I didn't want to go anywhere. And now I've spent 30 years flying around the world, and that would be a pretty easy way to describe how my life went differently than it might otherwise have gone. I went to college and majored in English, and was playing soccer, and a lot of my classmates went on to go to law school or take jobs in different kinds of businesses. That's something that might have happened. But I guess I'll put it, here's another way to think of it. When I went off to graduate school, I worked in a nursery outside of Seattle, Washington, and I was probably getting paid about $4.25 an hour, as I recall. But I loved the work. I just loved being outside and doing this physical labor and learning about plants. And I had a friend there who got me some work. This was 1979, and she got me some work as a technical writer for this something called a software company, and it paid $75 an hour. And I thought it was the most boring job I'd ever had. But when I finished it, and my friend said, this company is hiring, and you could probably get in on the ground floor. And I said, I'm so much happier working in the nursery. I don't want to do that kind of stuff. It was Microsoft, I would have gotten, I would have been rich beyond compare. But my life was destined to go in a different direction. And I think one of the, what Marvin learned from his interactions in the book he did with Bill Stafford was always saying, welcome, welcome. Just see where the poem will take you. Give yourself over to the language and see where it will take you. And that a lifetime of doing that has brought me to a lot of different places around the world, and that I could never have imagined that. I couldn't have imagined working in Iowa. I mean, that was not on my list of places to get a job. And and part of the reason I took the job at Iowa, I just spent 10 years traveling, covering a war, covering the World Cup in Italy, writing about monasteries in Greece. And I thought, I've done enough travel. So I'll take this job at Iowa. Oh my God, how I could ever have imagined that I was taking a job without travel is, I sometimes think, man, that's, what was I thinking?
So what you're saying is getting an English degree might actually lead you to travel the world, have an amazing job, and meet some of the most amazing people imaginable? Something
like that.
Hints to our students.
Yeah. And what I would say about that was, if you're trying to be a writer, you're going to have a lot of failure. You're going to have a lot of rejection. And that's true of all the arts. I mean, and so failure is built into the whole process. And that's part of what makes it fun. I was somewhere in the Middle East, and I got an email one day from a woman named Sarah Lewis, and she said, I'm writing a book on failure. Could I interview you about that? And I replied, I've been waiting my whole life for that invitation, you know? So when I got back to the country, we did this interview, and somehow or other, I came out. So where did you get the idea for this book? And at the time, her partner was Wynton Marsalis, the great jazz musician and from New Orleans. And she said, well, Wynton suggested it to me. And I said something kind of flippantly like, well, what does Wynton Marsalis know about failure? I mean, the guy he's got Grammys, he's got everything, you know? And she said, Wynton has known many failures. He thinks of auditions that didn't go well, of concerts that didn't go well. And out of those failures, out of that rejection, he became a bigger and bigger artist. And so the one piece of really great advice I got from Mark Strand early on was, he said, you know, a young writer, the most important thing is to maintain the illusion that you're a writer, because so much of the world will tell you they'll reject you, you're not a writer. But if you keep at it and you are serious about your vocation, you'll get better, for one thing, and it may lead to all kinds of discoveries that would have seemed unimaginable to you when you were starting out.
I totally agree. Dr. Smith would like to say one thing before we close here, but I want to thank Chris for joining us. Truly, always a pleasure to talk to you. I want to thank everybody who joined us. Thank you to the students, and I will turn it over to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dustin.
All right. Thank you, Dustin. First of all, thank you, Professor Merrill, for your keynote address. Thank you for the time you gave to our students today. Yesterday, they were over the moon. And hopefully we are able to invite you down when we're able to travel the world as we did before.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to thank you and thank everybody for showing up, especially those of you who were here with us throughout the day. It's been a very long day, but it's been a very enriching day as well. And so it's been a very enriching last 2 days of the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival. And so I just want to thank you all for showing up and helping us to see that the work that we did in putting this presentation together for you, is something that you are interested in. And, based on what we've seen from the different panels, we know that you want more of it. And so I want you guys to look out for more work coming from the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival. To share some potential good news, during one of the panels early on today, someone suggested that they may be willing to publish some work from some of our students after that was from the panel this morning. And so we're going to keep everything crossed and hope that that actually pans out. And, that's exactly the type of, that's why we're here. That's what we're trying to do. And so that was very encouraging for us to get that news today as well. But I also wanted you guys to know, if you're interested in finding out what we're doing, if you're interested in supporting us in any way, that means if you want to be a part of the planning committee, if you want to sponsor us financially, which is great, you can always get in contact with us through Blue Flamingo Literary Festival at gmail.com. You can also contact us through our social media. That's Blue Flamingo Literary Festival on IG, Instagram, and Blue Flamingo Literary Festival on Facebook as well. And so if you have any questions for us, any concerns, let us know. We are recording all of the sessions, so these will all be made available at some point. I think we're working on a YouTube station, but we may also post on the Facebook account as well. So when those are ready, we will post, and those of you who we have, whose email addresses we have, we'll forward that information on to you as well. So thank you all for being a part of the 4th annual Blue Flamingo Literary Festival, and we will see you throughout the year. It's not just this one time. We try to put on a program at least once a month. And so keep an eye out, and thank you all for showing up. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you all.